You know that one neighbor who acts like he runs the entire neighborhood? The kind who walks around with a clipboard like he is the president of the United States instead of a homeowners association. That was Gary Mitchell, our beloved, or rather infamous, HOA president. Gary was the kind of man who made it his life mission to make everyone else miserable. If your grass was half an inch too tall, Gary noticed. If your trash can was visible for more than 30 seconds after pickup, Gary noticed. If your kids left chalk drawings on the sidewalk, Gary took pictures and sent warnings. People used to joke that Gary had a hidden camera network just to keep tabs on us. But honestly, some of us were not sure it was a joke. For months, I kept my head down. I trimmed the hedges, rolled my trash bin in on time, and stayed quiet. But Gary had a way of finding targets, and eventually, his focus turned to me. It started small. One morning, I got a letter claiming that my mailbox was 2 inches higher than regulation height. I laughed at first, thinking it was a mistake. But nope, Gary had measured it himself. 2 days later, I received another notice, this time about a non-compliant shade of blue on my front door. Apparently, the color ocean sky was not as approved as sky ocean. Then came the fine, $50. That was when I realized this was not about rules, this was about control. So I decided to fight back, but I was not going to yell or argue. Oh no, Gary loved confrontation. It gave him power. I was going to do something that Gary never expected. I was going to be calm, patient, and very, very observant. A few weeks later, I was trimming my hedges when I noticed Gary's car parked in front of Mrs. Patterson's house. Mrs. Patterson was an older widow who lived alone. She was sweet, kind, and always baked cookies for neighborhood kids. I saw Gary walking out of her house, smiling in that fake politician way he always did. He was holding a folder. That caught my attention. A day later, I stopped by Mrs. Patterson's place just to check in. She looked worried. I asked if everything was all right, and she sighed. Oh, Gary came by again. She said, he told me I need to pay $300 for landscaping violations, but I already paid last month. He said it was an administrative error and that I should just write the check directly to him so he could handle it faster. My mind froze. Directly to him, that was not just pepper tripping. That was stealing. I played it cool, smiled, and said, do you still have that receipt from last month? She nodded and showed it to me. Sure enough, it was marked as paid and signed by Gary himself. Now, I knew I had him. That night, I pulled out my laptop and started digging. I went through the HOA's public meeting notes, scanned the budget reports, and compared them against the payments we all had made. Something was off. The numbers did not line up. Nearly $1,000 in miscellaneous administrative expenses appeared out of nowhere. Guess whose signature was on every approval line? Gary Mitchell. I knew I had to be careful. HOA boards love to protect their own, and if I made an open accusation, it would be dismissed as misunderstanding. So I kept collecting evidence. I quietly talked to a few neighbors who had gotten weird payment requests too. Most had brushed it off, but when I showed them what I found, they were furious. By the end of the week, I had compiled a full spreadsheet, names, dates, payments, and even copies of Gary's handwritten receipts. I drafted an email address to the HOA legal department, the treasurer, and just for dramatic effect, the County Housing Compliance Office. The subject line was simple: urgent, evidence of financial misconduct by HOA president. It took me hours to write that email. I was careful, detailed, and polite. I attached everything, scanned receipts, budget discrepancies, even Mrs. Patterson's testimony. And when I finally hit send, I sat back and whispered to myself. All it took was one email. The next few days were tense. Gary must have sensed something was wrong because he started acting paranoid. He was pacing around the neighborhood more than usual, taking notes, making phone calls, and glaring at my house every time he passed by. I pretended not to notice. Then, 3 days later, the HOA sent out an emergency meeting notice. It said, mandatory attendance for all residents, discussion regarding recent financial audit findings. That was my moment. When I arrived, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. People were whispering, confused, curious, maybe even hopeful. Gary walked in last, wearing his usual smug grin, but this time he looked uncomfortable. His tie was crooked, and there was sweat on his forehead. The meeting started with the treasurer, who cleared his throat and said, we received some concerning evidence regarding financial irregularities within the HOA accounts. We have verified the information, and it appears that funds were misappropriated. You could have heard a pin drop. The treasurer continued. The discrepancies point directly to President Gary Mitchell. Gasps filled the room. Mrs. Patterson, even stood up and said he told me to write him a check. Gary went pale. "That is ridiculous," he shouted. "These are false accusations." But then the treasurer held up a printed copy of my email. "We verified everything. The county office confirmed the receipts and signatures. The evidence is overwhelming." Gary tried to speak again, but it was too late. The board voted unanimously to remove him as HOA president, effective immediately. And just like that, after months of torment, fines, and arrogance, the king of the HOA was dethroned. When I walked out of that meeting, the neighbors were cheering. Mrs. Patterson hugged me. Todd slapped me on the back and said, "Man, you actually did it." I smiled. All it took was one email. But trust me, the real fun was only about to begin. When the meeting ended that night, I expected a sense of peace to wash over the neighborhood. You know, the calm after the storm. But instead, there was this weird silence in the air. No one knew what would happen next. Gary Mitchell was gone, stripped of his title, escorted out of the meeting room by the HOA treasurer like a disgraced celebrity leaving the stage. But even after his fall from power, his shadow still lingered. The HOA board announced that a temporary president would be chosen until the next election. Everyone clapped, smiled, and went home. Except me. I knew this story was not over, because people like Gary never go quietly. For the next few days, things were peaceful, too peaceful. No letters, no warnings, no passive-aggressive notes on doorsteps. The lawns started to look a little wilder. Trash cans stayed out longer. Kids drew chalk dragons across the sidewalks. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive. But just as I began to enjoy this new freedom, I received a message from the HOA board. "Dear residents, please join us for a special community gathering this Saturday to welcome our new interim HOA president." I sighed. "Here we go again," I muttered. Saturday arrived, and everyone gathered near the park at the center of the neighborhood. A small table with a white cloth stood in front of us, covered in muffins, juice, and those tiny paper plates that always collapse under anything heavier than a blueberry. The treasurer stepped forward with a bright smile. "Thank you all for coming. As you know, we are moving forward after a difficult few weeks. Today, we officially welcome our interim president, someone who has volunteered to restore order and community spirit." And then, she turned toward the side of the stage and said the name that made my stomach drop. "Please welcome, Marcia Caldwell." Oh, you have to be kidding me. Marcia was Gary's closest ally, his right hand, his shadow, his enforcer. If Gary was the king, Marcia was his loyal knight with a permanent scowl and a binder full of rules. The crowd clapped politely, but the energy had changed. Marcia took the microphone and smiled like a politician on election day. "Thank you, everyone. I know there has been drama recently, but I promise to bring back structure, civility, and proper neighborhood conduct." Translation: Fun time is over. I could practically feel my freedom evaporating. 2 days later, the first email arrived in my inbox. Reminder: lawn heights must remain consistent with HOA Regulation 5.2b. Followed by another: please remove decorative solar lights. They are considered non-standard. Then another: mailbox color variants still pending review. I laughed out loud. "She is trying to be Gary 2.0, I said to Todd. Todd shook his head. "Man, she is worse. Gary at least had charisma. Marcia looks like she has been mad since 1995. He was right. She was ruthless and clearly had not forgiven me for getting Gary fired. So I did what any normal person would do. I played along. At first, I kept every email, every warning, every note she sent, because I knew one thing about people like Marcia: they always take things too far. Sure enough, a week later, she finally did. I came home one afternoon to find a bright orange paper taped to my garage door. It said, in bold letters, "Notice of violation, potential property lien." Apparently, my crime was having non-compliant outdoor furniture. I looked at my porch chairs, plain brown, bought at a department store. Nothing fancy, nothing wild. But Marcia had declared them unsuitable for the neighborhood aesthetic. I could not believe it. She was trying to find me again. That was when I realized this was personal. I started asking around. Turns out, several neighbors had received ridiculous notices too, all from Marcia. One family was fined for having a pink garden gnome, another for parking their car too far to the left. Someone else got a warning because their welcome mat said "go away" instead of "welcome." The entire street was turning against her. I knew this was my moment. I invited a few neighbors over one evening: Todd, Mrs. Patterson, and a couple of new families who had recently moved in. We sat around my backyard fire pit and compared our letters. It looked like a legal office exploded. Mrs. Patterson said, "This woman is on a power trip worse than Gary ever was." Todd laughed. "We need to find a way to fire her, too." And then, like lightning, an idea hit me. If Gary was fired for misusing power, maybe Marcia could be too, but in a completely different way. I opened my laptop, pulled up the HOA Bibles, and scrolled until I found what I was looking for. Section 18C, Abuse of Authority Clause. Any officer who engages in excessive or discriminatory enforcement of HOA regulations, resulting in demonstrable distress or harm to residents, may be subject to removal by majority board vote. Bingo. If I could prove Marcia was targeting residents unfairly, I could get her removed, legally. So I began my next mission. Every email, every letter, every threat, I documented it. I gathered statements from neighbors, screenshots of her messages, and even a few security camera clips of her sneaking around taking photos of people's lawns at night. In just 1 week, I had enough evidence to fill a binder. I sent a message to the HOA board requesting an official grievance hearing. The subject line was simple, familiar, and poetic. Request for review. Pattern of abuse by HOA interim president. I could already picture Marcia's face when she would read it. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. When the day arrived, the boardroom was full again. Same table, same tension, but a brand new villain. Marcia sat at the front with her binder, smiling smugly. I walked in calm, holding my own folder labeled evidence. The treasurer began. "Mr. Williams, you filed this complaint. Please state your case." I stood up. "Thank you. My case is simple. This HOA is supposed to protect property values, not crush community spirit. And what we have here," I said, placing her letters on the table, "is a clear abuse of power." Gasps echoed through the room as I read out the most ridiculous warnings. Non-compliant garden, gnome, improper welcome mat, threat of lean over chairs. And worst of all, she'll find Mrs. Patterson again, this time for bird feeders. Mrs. Patterson raised her hand. "Yes," she said, "they attract unsanctioned species." The room burst into laughter. Marcia turned bright red. "These rules are necessary for order," she snapped. I smiled. Funny, that is exactly what Gary said before he was fired. The board members exchanged glances. And that was when I knew she was done. When the hearing finally started, I could feel the room tighten like a rubber band about to snap. Marcia sat at the head of the table with that same binder of rules she always used, like armor. She looked confident, which made me more confident, because people who look unbeatable usually have the softest spots. I waited until the treasurer cleared his throat and said, "Mr. Williams, you may proceed." I stood, set my folder on the table, and looked straight at the board. "This is not personal," I began. "This is about fairness, accountability, and how we treat our neighbors." Everyone leaned in a little. Good. I placed the stack of printed emails and notices in front of Marcia and flipped open the binder to a bookmarked page. I started reading.com and measured, like I was narrating the scene for a courtroom drama. I read the dates, the times, the exact wording of every absurd warning Marcia had issued. The pink gnome fine, the porch chair lien, Mrs. Patterson's bird feeder violation. I even read aloud an email where Marcia wrote, and I quote, "We must send a clear message. Nonconformity will not be tolerated." The room went quiet. That phrase would come back to haunt her. Then I showed something else. I pushed a thumb drive across the table and said, "Play this." The treasurer plugged it into his laptop. The screen filled the wall. There was video footage of Marcia walking up driveways at dusk, crouching behind hedges, photographing welcome mats. There was a clip of her knocking on a door, whispering, then leaving with a small list tucked into her binder. There was even a recording of a voicemail she left for a neighbor saying, "If you do not change your door color to approved tones, we will escalate this." You could see the color drain from her face. I kept that calm tone and said, "This is not about aesthetics. This is targeted enforcement. This is intimidation dressed up as policy." Marcia tried to talk over me. "Those are community standards," she said in that clipped voice. "I am simply enforcing the rules that keep our property values stable." A board member who had been quiet earlier, a woman named Paula, raised a hand and asked, "And when did enforcing rules become surveillance and selective punishment?" Marcia had no answer. The treasurer cleared his throat and said, "We have reviewed the complaint and the supporting evidence. Under Section 18C of our bylaws, officers who engage in discriminatory enforcement may be removed." He looked toward the board. "A vote is required." The mood in the room felt different than the time we had removed Gary. This felt like a community waking up. I handed out copies of the binder pages I had prepared, not just the emails and video clips, but testimony statements from neighbors, dates, and timestamps, even a spreadsheet that cross-referenced Marcia's enforcement actions with nighttime camera activity. People began to murmur. Mrs. Patterson, who had been quiet until that moment, stood up and said, "She told me my bird feeder attracted non-approved species. I told her I like blue jays. She wrote me forewarning letters." The room murmured louder. That was the human element. Concrete stories, not just documents. Marcia tried one last tactic. She accused me of grandstanding and said I was attempting to embarrass the board. I looked at her directly and said, "I am trying to protect this neighborhood from fear. I want people to stop hiding their holiday lights and stop ducking behind curtains when they water their plants. Do you want this place to feel like a home or a detention center?" The answer came in the faces of everyone watching. Many nodded. The vote was quick and decisive. The board convened in private for 5 minutes and returned. The treasurer rose and said, "By majority vote, Marcia Caldwell is removed from her position and suspended from HOA duties pending a formal review. This decision is effective immediately." A collective exhale swept through the room like wind through leaves. Marcia stood there, stunned. For a moment, she looked exactly like Gary had looked the night he was called out. I will not pretend I felt pity. I felt relief and a little satisfaction. But I also felt something else, the odd emptiness that follows when a long, exhausting fight finally ends. The next week, the neighborhood changed in ways I had hoped for. People started putting up planters without worrying who would photograph them at night. Porch furniture returned to Mrs. Patterson had a new bird feeder and a grin that would not quit. Todd organized a lazy Saturday potluck. The kids drew chalk dragons, bigger than any HOA rulebook. The whole place felt like a community again, not a managed facility. Still, life is never that neat. A few weeks later, I began to hear whispers that someone was angling to replace Marcia. I flat out told anyone who would listen that I would not let that happen. The last thing we needed was a second wave of tyrants. People agreed. In our next election, we nominated board members who actually lived here, not retirees who treated regulations like a sport. We even added a clause requiring clearer processes for enforcement and a mandatory transparency log whenever a board member filed a complaint. On a warm Saturday morning, we held a small community picnic in the park. Someone broke out a guitar. The kids chased each other through the sprinkler. Mr. Peterson grinned like a man who had rediscovered youth. I sat on a folding chair and watched neighbors chat, trade stories, exchange tomato seedlings. A group of new board members stood nearby, fielding questions with an honesty I had not seen from the last couple of administrations. At one point, Mr. Reed, the treasurer who had helped call out Gary and who had voted to remove Marcia, came over with a paper cup of lemonade and sat down. He looked at me and said, "You did good work, not just with the email, but everything you did after. You helped us remember why we formed this HOA in the first place." I smiled and said, "We remembered together." He nodded. "We need more of that." Months later, I received a letter in the mail. Not a violation notice. Not a thin, bureaucratic memo. It was a short, handwritten note from Mrs. Patterson. It said, "Thank you for saving our peace, for saving our garden club, for giving us back our porches. Come by tonight for tea." I hung that note on my fridge like a badge. The new board published a quarterly newsletter that listed improvements and a new, simplified complaint form that required signatures and photographic evidence and accountability. No more anonymous midnight accusations. No more clipboard dictators. It felt like the bylaws had finally learned to serve people, not to be used as weapons. I will not claim everything was perfect. People still had disagreements. Some complained when new board members trimmed trees without consulting everyone. You cannot run a neighborhood without occasional tiffs, but the difference now was that disputes were handled openly, civilly, and with a touch of common sense. One warm evening, as the sun slanted golden over the roofs, I walked past Mrs. Patterson's porch. She waved me over and handed me a small plate of cookies, the kind she had once baked for children, delivering Halloween candy. I sat, ate one, and we watched a pair of kids race their bikes down the block. For a moment, everything felt right. This whole thing started with a mailbox, fine, an odd-color complaint, and my decision to stop being a passive target. It ended with the community stepping up, voting, and changing how it wanted to be governed. Gary is gone. Marcia is gone. Their reigns were brief but instructive. The real victory was not merely their removal. The real victory was that people remembered they were neighbors, not cogs in an enforcement machine. So when someone asks how I got the HOA president fired, I tell them the truth. I sent an email. I documented the facts. I rallied neighbors to stand up, not scream, and we insisted on accountability. Sometimes the simplest act can set things in motion. All it took was one email and a lot of neighbors willing to care enough to act.